Hi there, and welcome to the panel discussion titled Learning from Other Jurisdictions, an International Perspective. My name is Amina Dib, and I'm the Manager of Government and Stakeholder Relations at the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, also known as RESCON. Today I'll be moderating the session, which features David Amborski from Ryerson University, Deputy Mayor of Toronto, Anna Bilau, Catherine Stone, representing Western Cape Government, and Annette Scheib-Lorenzi from the City of Stockholm. Before we officially start, I wanted to remind audience members that they are encouraged to post questions and comments for panelists in Whova. Many other countries and cities are facing a lack of housing supply combined with double-digit price rises. Recognizing that every jurisdiction has unique characteristics and that there are different ways to achieve market equilibrium, what are the best ideas that Ontario can incorporate? Perhaps a Made in Ontario solution could include the most effective elements from elsewhere. That's what we'll be talking about today. What can we learn from elsewhere, and how could it be applied to Ontario's path forward? But first, let's give our panelists a brief moment to introduce themselves, starting with Deputy Mayor Bilau.
Thank you, Amina. My name is Anna Bilau. I'm Deputy Mayor in the City of Toronto, also Chair of the Planning and Housing Committee, and have been elected official for almost 12 years and looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bilau. Now on to David.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm David Amborski. I'm the director of the School of the Center for Urban Research and Land Development at Ryerson University. I'm a faculty member there, and I was a member of the province's Affordable Housing Task Force.
Welcome, David. Catherine?
A warm good evening from Cape Town in South Africa. Or good afternoon to you all in Canada. It's such a privilege to be able to participate in this discussion, so thank you. I am the Director of Spatial Planning in the provincial Western Cape Government. Our primary city is Cape Town, and I am leading the project to prepare an inclusionary housing policy framework for the province. Thank you.
Thank you. And Annette?
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Annette Scheib-Lorenzi from Stockholm, City of Stockholm in Sweden. I'm head of the city planning administration, and I've been in that position for 8 years. And I'm also a member of the task force for housing in the City of Stockholm.
Thank you. So we'll move on to some questions. So we'll start with David. We often hear the term housing supply shortage, but it's not too often broken down. Can you give us kind of like a breakdown in terms of supply or housing type, what you're hearing from both Canada and the US?
Well, I think in both US markets, and Canadian markets, there's the same kind of approach. They both have housing supply shortage issues. And again, I could cite some of the examples of this. I'll probably give you a book coming out on that soon in the US. But when you're looking at that, you have to look at all locations and all types. And in our context as the US, you have to look at both greenfield development, something at the external boundaries of cities. And I'm not talking about sprawl, I'm talking about orderly development and having ground associated units. We have an issue with that in the Canadian context, as they do in some US markets. And also the infill development, the redevelopment. And that's where you need to address things through things like secondary streets, laneway housing, and also issues about zoning regulations and deregulating exclusionary zoning, which has been a much issue that's been longer boiling in the US than here. And we can learn something from what they're doing in those particular jurisdictions.
Thanks, David. Deputy Mayor Bilau, Toronto has been working to implement major housing initiatives to create more affordable housing, including activating city-owned public land. How has Toronto been mobilizing its land assets to achieve affordable housing?
Thank you for the question, Amina. And before I start telling you about our Housing Now program, which is the program that activates our city land, I just want to say that we in Toronto see the supply side of the equation is part of the answer for the housing problem. I think when we talk about the housing continuum, I think there's a few things that we need to understand. The supply, the market side of things is never going to create, for example, the supportive housing or deeply affordable housing that we need. So I think it is important to recognize that governments still need to invest in deep affordable housing, in particular supportive housing and this kind of housing. The other thing is that we need actions both on the supply and on the demand side. At all levels. We at the city, this has been the first year that we have a vacant home tax. These kinds of initiatives are important in order to have a healthy housing spectrum and good housing policy. With regards to bringing more housing supply, one of the first things that we started looking at, it was our own land. We currently have a program that is called the Housing Now program. We have 21 pieces of land that is going to create over 15,000 units, including 1/3 of that as affordable housing and rental, which is also very much needed, market rental as well, and some ownership. So not only are we using our land to leverage more supply, and all these are very close to areas where major transit investment is also being done. So double win, we think. But the other thing is these were the very first projects that we included in a new development process, which we call concept to keys. So we understand that we need to improve and speed and have a better relationship with the industry to reduce the time of approvals. And so these were the first group of properties that went in there. We're also looking at what David was talking about, we call the missing middle. And I know that the task force talks about getting rid of exclusionary zoning. In the city of Toronto, we have an initiative as well that is called EHON, Enhancing Housing Opportunities, and is looking at exactly that. We've approved laneway housings, we've approved garden suites, we're looking at multiplexes, increased density in some of our arterials, and so this is a process that we are going down that path because we do believe that the majority of the land in the city of Toronto that is zoned now mostly for single family homes, we need to look at that given the need for supply and the need for land to build homes. We also just approved inclusionary zoning in the city of Toronto, and we're still in the process because according to the province, we need to have the PMTSA is approved, but the policy is in place. The minister did not appeal, so it is a policy that is in place. So these are some of the actions that we're taking in Toronto, using our planning tools, zoning tools, using some of our taxing tools, using some of our land, some of our assets as well, given the very, very restrictive taxing powers that we have in municipalities in Ontario, and the continuing increase in responsibility in housing in our province.
Thanks, Anna. That was your last point about inclusionary zoning was a good segue into the question I'm going to ask Annette. So Annette, Canadians often look to Scandinavian countries as a model for many things, especially like the social safety, the way the social safety net operates, but also like the building and development industry, and how you deliver social housing. And I think there are some similarities there. But what do you think is the strongest tool in order to make housing supply accessible for lower income households?
I would say we don't have, thank you for the question. We don't have the concept, the real concept, social housing, but I would say our strongest tool is, of course, our land use policy in combination. If we combine our land use policy with guidelines for housing provision and the city comprehensive plan, the city plan on how the city should expand, our land use policy is the strongest tool we have, because the city of Stockholm, we own 70% of the land within the city, so we can use the land use policy to reach the city's goal to enable the construction of 140,000 new homes between 2010 and 2030. 50% of those 140,000 new apartments will be rental apartments. And right now, about 60,000 of those 140,000 are built, and 20,000 will be started next year and the next year after. So that's okay. But this goal means that we will increase the number of housing in the city of Stockholm by 25% the forthcoming years. And this goal means that we can use the income if we sell land for public for owned homes. We can sell and we can use the income and the great impact of all this building to make improvements in the environment in every part of the city, which is important if you talk about social inclusions and so on, but in the city as a whole. But then we have our system of long land lease hold right for a special site for those who build rental housing, which means that they will have a long land lease on a long leasehold right for those who build rental housing. And this economic mix gives us the strength in order to reach even the goal for 50% of rental housing. But we still have problems, or a challenge, I would say, for when it comes to affordable housing. So we have some different tools, and we have started for a couple of years ago to develop different land models for affordable housing. And we also have our own concept for serial housing. We call it Stockholmshusen, which is one of our largest projects, with the goal to reach lower income households with about 5,000 new rental apartments. But it's still a challenge, of course. We need to do much more. This is some kind of tools, but the strongest tool is, of course, 50% rental housing.
Thanks,
I don't know
Annette.
if that was a clarification.
Yes, it was. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And then just going back to this discussion on inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing policy. Catherine, what makes it difficult to stimulate confidence in inclusionary zoning housing policy, at least from the South African experience?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's very much linked to what has been mentioned before by the previous speakers. If the state isn't releasing its land, it makes it quite difficult to introduce a policy placing obligations on private developers. And we in South African cities have land parcels owned by different spheres of government and real challenges around trying to unlock that land. The provincial government has also committed to releasing its land and reviewing its land, and where it is appropriate for housing, looking at 50% of that being affordable. But these developments largely have to pay for themselves. The South African subsidy regime for housing is really focused on the poorest of the poor, households earning around $230 a month. And for higher density, better located housing, it makes it really difficult to use that subsidy. So land is the other, and again, like everyone else has mentioned, we are suggesting that we have an approach to inclusionary housing, which is incentive driven, which is looking to one of the incentives being a much quicker approvals process. But there's a lot of cynicism around that because currently it is difficult to get quick planning approval. And this is one of the very significant cost drivers in the Western Cape for property prices. And so we're having to work with municipalities at the same time to try and urge them to understand what is driving the long time frames, and where can we get better efficiencies, also recognizing that we as a provincial government play a role in related permissions such as heritage and environment. So a great deal of coordination needed, but also giving confidence to municipalities to take more decisions themselves, which they're able to in the legislation. But those are kind of the two big aspects that we've confronted amongst developers when responding to the proposal for inclusionary zoning.
Thanks, Catherine. Another good segue into my next question. When you mentioned like timelines for municipalities and really all actors within the development process. Deputy Mayor Bilau, do you think there should be stronger mechanisms to ensure that timelines or metrics are met as it relates to internally as it relates to planning and development?
You know what, more and more we're hearing that municipalities need to do better at doing the approvals. And I think we all recognize that. That's why in Toronto, we created the concept to keys. We did a development end-to-end review and said, we need to do better. I think we are at a stage that we need to be more collaborative between the industry and the municipality. I think we need to bring innovation into the system. I think both the industry and the city, not only do we need to bring bodies to do the approvals, which is very true. And I think both the industry and us, everybody's looking for people to work in the sector because everybody's short-staffed. But I also think we need to bring the innovation, the technology into the system, because I'm a counselor. I deal with these applications also regularly. And sometimes, yes, there's many delays on the municipality, but sometimes there's delays on the developer as well. And the developer is supposed to submit, their third review 2 months ago, and his consultants are not giving them the work, and there's also a delay there. So I think we need to come together and work better on that. The average that it takes, between 36, sometimes 48 months of approvals from the concept to keys, there needs to be a commitment from everybody to reduce that. And there's different things that I think we as a municipality can definitely do to improve. I think the industry needs to do to improve. I think, I'm a big supporter that there are some projects, for example, around affordable housing that sometimes are appealed by many people just because they're affordable housing, not because of anything else. So I think that we need to create policy around these things that do not allow for things like that to happen. And the other issue as well is the capacity of the industry also to build, which we're starting to feel here in Toronto. There's such a huge shortage of labor and trades. And I know that you have another panel on that, but we're starting to feel that as well. So that needs to be part of the conversation as well. So I think that more and more we need to look at this and instead of saying, oh, it's all the municipality's fault, it's not. I mean, there's provincial agencies involved, right? I had to, get a hold of a provincial agency recently because we had a developer that could not get, feedback from Metrolinx. And they couldn't get things moving. So everybody's a little bit at fault. And so we need to make sure that we're working in a collaborative, cooperative way. But I think the capacity and see what policies we can change and bring some technology innovation, even how to create some accountability and speed up the process.
I'm nodding aggressively at the innovation piece, and thanks for the plug to the other panel I'll be participating in on the skilled trades and labor supply shortages. Go ahead, David.
I'd like to weigh in on this because I totally agree with Anna, and I really applaud what the city is doing with their concept to keys. People keep talking about the approvals process and trying to improve it. This is something that's been studied and talked about in Ontario in the 70s and 80s and for many, many years. And here the people are talking about electronic submission. It's more than just like electronic submission. It's having a platform that you can move things around, have the most recent information, and move it from person to person who's approving it, such as Concept to Keys is trying to do. There's also an aspect of Concept to Keys is change management, getting people to respond in a timely fashion. So there's a number of pieces to this that you have to move collectively. It's more than just sometimes people call electronic submission. That's simple. I heard municipalities in the past say sometimes would accept things electronically. Once they got it electronically, they have to move it to their platform. That's not efficient. So that comes into play. And again, I also agree with her on the labor issue, the supply of skilled labor. That's one of the things we looked at in the task force. And if you look at the skilled labor force now, and look at their age, a lot of people are getting close to retirement. So the shortage is going to continue. So we need to do more training and educating of our young people that this is a good trade to go into. And also we have to look at the way we admit people under immigration, look for people who have these skills and give them higher points. So we have to gear up the skill level as well. So both of those are very, very important points.
Thank you. Any other comments on what Councillor Bilo said from Annette or Catherine, or really anything that anyone said? Yeah.
No, I just want to add what the councillor said about the timelines and schedules, and that the municipalities should do so much more. I would also like to stress what you said about collaboration, because what we do now, we all operate in cities and we're building dense cities, adding more housing and buildings in an already existing environment. And we would like to use the proximity to public transport, which means that the plannings, the circumstances for planning is more and more complex, and the regulation on a state level doesn't follow this complexity. It means that we're struggling with, there are no easy plots. We're struggling with pollution or heavy construction works and so on. And I think that the collaboration means that the state level must follow and do something about legislation, because it's too hard. The complexity is getting harder and harder, and it won't be easier, and we won't stop to build. This is a big issue right now in Stockholm or in Sweden. It's too hard, and the processes is getting more and more complex, and we can't wait. So we have to discuss on some overall, the regulation, the planning process, the whole concept of it, and also the standard, actually, in what we build.
Catherine, and just as the flag, I have to hop off in 2 minutes to go attend my other panel. So if you just see me leave, that's why. But David will be closing out the panel.
Yeah, I think we can also echo the concerns around the kind of the elaborate regulation that controls land use development that might not be matched to the extent of need and how quickly we need to respond. One of the things we're looking at is how do we do more of the planning up front in the kind of spatial planning and policy planning stages to de-risk development further downstream, and do sufficient planning up front that we can create more space in the regulatory space, I suppose, having done more of the public participation up front, perhaps through the system designing that less is required downstream, because we've set that up in forward planning much more thoroughly in working with communities and designing the policy planning system that tries to preempt this. So trying to do a lot more of that up front. It's hard work, it is difficult, and it's messy, but that is also something we're looking at to try and ease the way further downstream in the planning permissions processes.
I'll kick it over to David now to moderate.
Thank you. One of the themes on the supply side is monitoring basically the supply and having better data. Mayor Jeff Lehman talked about that this morning. On one side, on the demand side, having a better understanding of what you need to provide, but there's also the supply side. And that has to do with both the infill and the greenfield sites. And I know this is not so much something for Anna and the city of Toronto, but one of the things is that you do need a mix of housing types, ground associated. You have to have some balance of greenfield sites and infill. And I'm curious what the experience has been, for example, in the international speakers' experience in monitoring land supply along those lines. We used to have very good work done by CMHC and by the province up until 2003. We looked at the supply of lots and subdivisions in the greenfield sites. That stopped. And under our provincial policy statement, municipalities are supposed to monitor and keep a 3-year supply of lots available by housing type, and they're not doing that. And that's one of the issues. We're not monitoring the supply. We don't know where we need to increase the supply. And of course, the supply on the infill side is the supply of missing middle. How do we create more supply for that? And that's with the zoning regulations. So I'd be interested in any other international experience with that from Scandinavia or from South Africa. I know the US is moving forward in that direction. I won't talk about that. We can access that later. But I'd be interested in panelists' comments about that. Of course, Anna can speak to the approach in the city doing the studies right now. Actually, my students are working on one with the city on how to increase the supply of mid-rise units. So I'd open that up for discussion.
If I can
David,
jump.
go ahead, Catherine.
No, I mean, from a provincial perspective, we've also recognized that, and what we're doing is commissioning housing market studies at town level within some of the bigger municipalities in order to gather both housing supply and demand data, and do that in such a way that we can empower the municipalities to see how that data can be. It's actually all of their own data that we're asking them to lend us to process and then give back to them in a housing market study. So certainly in this process, trying to empower them to understand the power of that data and to inform their decisions. I think there's a bit of I guess, a scattergun approach in terms of also, as of right, 3 dwellings on every property to try and stimulate supply, but that's slow going. But also creating a much more conducive environment for micro developers. So what we're seeing in our context is micro developers taking single residential stands, particularly in townships, I suppose, where there's less concerns around maintaining a status quo, building 3-story boarding houses or 3-story flats units, and trying to create a much more streamlined environment for them. So there are lots of different ways in which we're thinking about supply, but understanding land and modeling what's possible is something that we still need to do a lot of work on.
Thank you.
Councillor Anna, maybe first.
Go ahead. No? Go ahead.
We have different tools, but every year the National Board of Housing, Building and Planning do this analysis for all the municipalities in Sweden. But of course we have on our level as well, both the regional analysis yearly on supply and demand, and then in our guidelines for housing provision, which we renew every year according to the legislation. We have to do it. But our portfolio for housing portfolio, the 140,000, the analysis on that one and how to use our resources and what to plan and which developer to give land or to sell land till and then to develop also consists of the overall goal, build rental housing, and if there are housing for special needs, for short-term solutions for those who are very far from the regular market, lower income households and so on. So this is something we do each year on the national, regional, but also municipal level.
David, I'm going to comment. I think Mayor Lehman is absolutely right in terms of the data and what we need, but I think we already have some data. So for example, in the city of Toronto, we produce an average of 16,000 units a year built. 89% of those are apartments, and we know that the majority of them are, we just have the stats coming out there in the downtown. So we know what those projects look like. The majority of them have 30% family units and 70% are one-bedroom condos. And then people get surprised why the number of children in the city is decreasing and families are going out, because there's not supply of that being produced. And I've started to question, is it also the way that we're financing some of these projects? Because two things: we don't have the land to have in the families. We have very restrictive zoning in 35% of our land, where some of those units, the lower grade, maybe a triplex, where tend to be a little bit bigger, where families want to live, extremely restrictive zoning. And then we also have this financing system that you require 70% to be financed before shovels in the ground. And let's be honest, how many families have all this money in the bank that they can go and buy a unit and then wait 5 years for the unit to be done? So I think we need to start asking some of these questions, because this, I think, also contributes to the kind of supply that we have, and to what we're having in there. So yes, we need the data. We all know that we need more family size units, but how do you translate that into being built? And I think all this, the zoning, also the financing, also the systems that we have in place are not producing the supply that we actually need. And I think we need to seriously look into this with all these different tools that create a home, right? The home it has zoning, legislative powers, you need the land, you need the financial, you need the labor to build it. So how do you look at all this and say, there's something here that is not, we don't have the wheel is not complete, is not, there's no integrity in the wheel because it's not producing what we need.
Thank you. I think the city does have pretty good data, but it's much more contained because you understand what's being built. So you have a better handle on supply. And the greenfield sites, it's a matter of keeping track of what's coming on board from greenfield land, which is a little more difficult and hasn't been done. But your case is one that's very interesting, because that's dealing with that missing middle, the yellow belt, and the zoning regulations being changed. So the question is, how do you change those zoning regulations to encourage the kind of housing you're talking about? Does it require incentives for certain types of housing? Again, Mayor Lehman talked about some of the old programs where various different orders of government might have to contribute to provide incentives with, they called multi-unit residential building kind of tax breaks or something along those lines. So the question is, what do you think you need for addressing the missing middle and getting the kind of housing you need? Because one of the things right now is that, again, I'm going to go back to the US situation. They've been changing the zoning regulations in a lot of cities, Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, so on. And next week, there's actually a panel discussion in the US I'm going to attend, showing that in some cases, this isn't really leading to the kind of housing they like, because there's still other impediments. So it's a much more complex issue. So again,
yeah.
Do you have issues? Do you have any questions or suggestions for how you might move forward with this?
I think this missing middle conversation, for example, in the city of Toronto, we need to look, for example, our development charges. You can't ask, right now we have a standard development charge, even though that in many of these neighborhoods, for example, there's been a decrease in population, where we're trying to say, oh, this is why we need missing middle, because we have it neighborhoods in the city of Toronto, the one that I represent, that even though there's some development on the main streets, I have less 2,500 residents in the area that I represent than 5 years ago. And so the question is, should we be charging the exact development charges if you're turning your house from a big house into a duplex, because that might disincentivize people from actually going down the road. In some ways, it makes projects that really not viable. So I think that all that conversation we need to look, and I think we need to use all our tools to nudge the development that we need and the supply that we need, being tax tools, development charge tools, land planning, rezoning. Like it needs to be aligned. These things needs to be aligned. What we need is the missing middle, the bigger units. We need to make sure that all these tools favor those kinds of units to be produced, because at the end of the day, it's a better public good. It's a better social good. So I think that when we're talking about missing middle, we need to look at that as well. And construction costs. I know that a lot of people, for example, for laneway housing, I'm starting to hear about modular laneway housing, modular garden. How can we decrease some of these costs to make it easier, to make it faster, and to make it more economical so that it makes sense?
Are there any other international examples of this? What are you doing in the other countries represented? Are there any incentives or any, key policies or regulations that might help us address this issue? No,
Catherine, no?
I hear none. So
No, I'm just, I can't think of it.
okay.
I mean, we are thinking harder on the incentives. I think, but I really like the Deputy Mayor's point, because I do think, particularly in a country like South Africa, where the security of everyone's future is dependent on how it goes for any country, I suppose. There's this constant looking to government, and yes, how is the finance sector helping, and how it designs its structures to make it possible to build a better form. And these, we've also been having conversations around development contributions, and there's this great fear around the short-term loss of revenue, but not perhaps enough time spent understanding the long-term savings of a more efficient city, and what that means for longer-term sustainability, fiscal sustainability. And we really need to do a lot more homework to research and model that, to try and help our colleagues, our accountant colleagues, who are really just concerned about the short-term income, around what this means for the long-term future of the cities. So we don't have the answers, but we certainly agree with the problem and share it, and know what we need to do.
I think everyone can agree on the challenge and what we know what to do, but we still don't have all the tools.
So we're all facing similar challenges in these areas and trying to feel our way through. So maybe we should focus on that sometime in the future and come back and really try to address this as we're going forward. Part of the problem is, of course, that some of these policies take a long time to develop and take a long time to put in place. You don't see the impacts for a long time. For example, the city of Toronto is addressing this with a 2-year pilot project. And the problem is, this is a real issue you want to address quickly. You have a 2-year pilot project and 1 year evaluating. It's not till 3 years that you bring in a new policy. And in some ways, that's a very, very long time to go forward. So if you can get some interim effects and begin to understand this by understanding the economics behind this. There was another theme that I think that the Mayor Lehman had talked about, understanding the economics and understanding your tools by looking at the pro forma analysis and how you can incent the developers and how you can work with those things together. So again, better information, better data, understanding the land economics behind this. That's one of my themes. I was happy to hear the Mayor talking about that, because that's something that's very
David,
important.
I agree so much. I think that it's what I said. These tools need to be aligned. I call it, because if we don't have alignment and if we continue to work in silos, all we do is what I call feel-good policy. Those policies that actually look wonderful on paper, but don't produce a unit. People love to do that because the economics don't work. Like, we need to make sure that all these tools are aligned, because it's not only planning that ends up producing a housing. There's a whole bunch of factors that needs to be taken in consideration. And we need to make sure that all our policies are aligned.
On a national, regional and municipal level, it means to be a policy that consists of every parts of it. I mean, we need That's what we really want in Sweden. Distinct and well worked out housing policy in all the parts, from planning to the land economic and land use. Which kind of incentives, investments, all of it. We have some subsidies, of course, investment subsidies, but are they efficient? Will they reach this goal? We don't know yet.
So I think we have some common agreement on this. We need to look at these
Yeah.
things together. And I'm getting the flag that we have to stop soon. And that also includes, as you were talking in the beginning, to bring it back to the beginning, you're all talking about leveraging public land as public assets. That's a very important part as well. So we can come
Yes.
back to that. And it's understanding that economics as well, because it can't all be market housing. You have to provide non-market housing, and leveraging public assets is ideal for that. So maybe we can end at that point, because I'm getting the signal we're supposed to go. And I'd like to thank all of the panelists for your great insights and comments. I think it was very useful. We learned from each other. So thank you, Anna and Catherine and Annette. We appreciate your input, and hopefully we'll keep in touch. Bye for now.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Bye.
Bye.